the forgotten genius who powered every device on Earth and got almost zolts nothing for it. There is a quiet kind of tragedy that history loves to commit. It is not the tragedy of failure. It is the tragedy of a man who succeeds so completely, so profoundly, that the world simply absorbs his gift and moves on, never pausing to ask, who gave it to them? We carry his invention in our pockets. We charge it every night on our nightstands. We have built entire economies, industries, electric revolutions on top of it, and almost none of us know his name. This is the stories of John Bannister Goodenough, the man who invented the lithium-ion battery and gave it away. The man the Nobel Committee nearly forgot. The man who changed the modern world from a cramped laboratory at Oxford University, well into his 60s, at an age when most scientists are writing their memoirs. And the man who, despite his gift powering everything from your iPhone to a Tesla Model S, saw almost none of the financial reward that should have followed. But to understand why what he did was so extraordinary, we first have to understand the impossible problem he was trying to solve. Cast your mind back to the 1970s. The world was in an energy crisis. Oil prices had exploded. The Arab oil embargo had brought the most powerful economy on Earth to its knees. Gas lines stretched for miles, and in the laboratories of America, a quiet, desperate race had begun not to find more oil, but to find a way to store energy itself, to bottle electricity, to make it portable, rechargeable, and powerful enough to change civilization. The battery had existed for over a century by this point. Alessandro Volta had demonstrated it in 1800, but the batteries of the 1970s were essentially evolutionary cousins of that same original design: heavy, slow to charge, quick to die, and frustratingly limited. Lead-acid batteries had been powering car engines since the 1880s. Nickel-cadmium rechargeable batteries were the best portable option available, and they were clunky, toxic, suffered from something called the memory effect, which meant that if you didn't drain them completely before recharging, they permanently lost capacity. They were the technological equivalent of a leaky bucket. The world needed something categorically better, but the physics of it seemed almost insurmountable. Here is what the scientists knew. A battery works through a chemical reaction between two electrodes, a positive one called the cathode and a negative one called the anode, with a liquid or solid in between called the electrolyte that allows ions, which are electrically charged atoms, to travel back and forth. When ions flow one way, you generate electricity. When you force them back the other way with external power, you recharge the battery. The trick is finding the right materials that can absorb and release ions thousands of times without breaking down, without catching fire, without wearing out. This sounds elegant in theory. In practice, it was a nightmare of chemistry, physics, engineering, and pure stubbornness. Every material that worked well had a catastrophic flaw. Every breakthrough came with a hidden disaster lurking inside it. And this is where our story begins, not with John Goodenough yet, but with a brilliant, restless chemist named M. Stanley Whittingham. In the early circa 1970s, Whittingham was working at Exxon, the oil company, of all places, because even oil companies could see the writing on the wall. He made a discovery that lit the scientific world on fire. He found that lithium, the lightest metal on the periodic table, could be used as an electrode in a battery. Lithium ions, it turned out, were extraordinarily eager to give up and reclaim electrons. They were the perfect candidate for a rechargeable battery. Whittingham built the first prototype of a lithium battery. It was remarkable. It had more energy density than anything before it, and it recharged. But it had a problem. A violent, terrifying problem. Lithium metal, when used as the anode, tends to grow tiny needle-like structures called dendrites during charging, microscopic metallic spikes that eventually pierce through the battery separator, cause an internal short circuit, and in the most dramatic cases, cause the battery to burst into flames. Whittingham's batteries were promising, brilliant, and quietly dangerous. Exxon, eventually shut down the program. The first lithium battery revolution fizzled before it began. And that is when John Goodenough enters the story. Goodenough was not your typical scientist. He had been born in Jena, Germany in 1922, the son of an American academic and a woman who, by most accounts, was emotionally distant and cold a childhood he later described with the careful, measured pain of a man who learned early to find his sense of purpose in work rather than family warmth. He was dyslexic, which made his early education a struggle. But something burned inside him, a ferocious, almost monastic commitment to understanding things deeply. He had trained in physics, not chemistry. He had fought in World War II, served as a meteorologist in the Azores, and arrived at the University of Chicago at the age of 23 to begin his graduate studies, only to be told by a professor, in one of history's more embarrassing moments of academic gatekeeping, that anyone who hadn't started studying physics by the age of 23 was surely too old to succeed. Goodenough, characteristically, ignored this entirely and went on to spend the next 7 decades making that professor look ridiculous. By the time Goodenough arrived at Oxford University in 1976, he was 54 years old and the head of the inorganic chemistry laboratory. He had already made foundational contributions to our understanding of magnetic materials and solid-state physics. He was, by any measure, already a distinguished scientist. But he was about to do something that would dwarf everything that came before it. He had read Whittingham's papers on lithium batteries with intense interest. He understood the core problem. The lithium metal anode was too dangerous, but Goodenough believed that the more important question was about the other electrode, the cathode. He believed that if you could find the right cathode material, you could store lithium-ion safely, stably, and at a high enough voltage to make a practical, rechargeable battery. His team began experimenting with metal oxides compounds of metals and oxygen as cathode materials. And in 1980, after years of methodical, grinding laboratory work, Goodenough and his colleagues discovered it: lithium cobalt oxide, a cathode material that could absorb and release lithium ions with stunning efficiency, at a voltage nearly double what Whittingham had achieved, and with a stability that made it genuinely safe to cycle through hundreds of charges. It was, without exaggeration, one of the most consequential material science discoveries of the 20th century. And here is where the story takes a turn that makes every entrepreneur and inventor in the world wince. Oxford University, under British law and the conventions of the time, filed a patent on the discovery. But the university, not seeing the immediate commercial application, licensed that patent to a number of companies without aggressively enforcing it or monetizing it in a way that would eventually reflect its true worth. Goodenough himself received almost nothing, no royalties, no windfall, not a share of the billions and then trillions of dollars in economic value that would ultimately flow from his discovery. It was as if someone had invented the wheel and been handed a polite thank you note. The company is to Goodenough's discovery and ran with it were primarily Japanese. Sony Corporation, in particular, recognized what the Oxford patent represented. Their engineers, working through the 1980s, solved the remaining piece of the puzzle: what to use as the anode instead of dangerous lithium metal. They settled on carbon, specifically graphite. Lithium ions could nestle safely between the layers of a graphite anode during charging, then migrate to the cathode during discharge, with no deadly dendrite formation. Sony combined Goodenough's lithium cobalt oxide cathode with a graphite anode, and in 1991 launched the world's first commercial lithium-ion battery. The impact was immediate. Within a decade, lithium-ion batteries were inside laptops, camcorders, mobile phones. By the early 2000s, they were inside the first generation of iPods, iPhones, and essentially every piece of consumer electronics on Earth. And then, as the world turned its anxiety from oil crises to climate crises, lithium-ion batteries became the heart of a new revolution: electric vehicles. Tesla built its original roadster out of thousands of lithium-ion cells. The Model S, Model 3, the Chevy Bolt, the Nissan Leaf, the vast and expanding universe of electric vehicles, all of them running on a technology whose fundamental architecture traces directly back to a laboratory at Oxford and one man's stubbornly brilliant mind. Today, the global lithium-ion battery market is worth hundreds of billions of dollars annually and is projected to exceed $1 trillion by the end of this decade. The supply chains built around it: lithium mining in Chile and Australia, cobalt extraction in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the gigafactories rising across the United States, Europe, and China constitute one of the most strategically vital industrial ecosystems in human history. Nations are fighting, quite literally, for control of the raw materials. Governments are spending hundreds of billions of dollars to domesticate supply chains that for most of the past 30 years ran through Asia. And underneath all of it, invisible to almost everyone, is the work of a man who spent his career at a British university and received no royalties for any of it. But Goodenough did not stop. This is the part of the story that almost defies belief. He did not retire. He did not write a bitter memoir. He did not spend his 70s and 80s lecturing about how the world owed him something. Instead, he kept working. He moved to the University of Texas at Austin, where he would spend the next decades continuing to push the boundaries of battery science. In his late 80s and early 90s, at an age when most people are happy to remember where they put their keys, Goodenough was publishing peer-reviewed research papers on next-generation solid-state batteries, trying to solve the battery problem all over again at a deeper level. And then, in October 2019, the phone rang. John Goodenough, age 97, was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. He shared it with Stanley Whittingham, and with a Japanese chemist named Akira Yoshino, who had refined Sony's early work on the carbon anode. It was the right call, even if it came decades late. And Goodenough, characteristically, received the news with the kind of calm that comes from a man who has spent a lifetime caring more about the work than the recognition. He became, at 97 years and 165 days old, the oldest person in history ever to receive a Nobel Prize. When a reporter asked him what advice he had for young scientists, he said, with a slight smile, that he would encourage them to be patient, that the most important work often takes also the anyone and expects, and that the reward, in the end, is the work itself. The supply chain wars raging around lithium and cobalt today tell a different chapter of the same story, one where nations belatedly realize that the technology one man essentially gave to the world for free now sits at the center of geopolitical power competition. China currently controls the dominant share of global lithium processing capacity and battery manufacturing. The United States passed the Inflation Reduction Act in part to try to claw back some of that ground. The European Union is scrambling to build its own battery manufacturing ecosystem. The Democratic Republic of Congo, one of the poorest nations on Earth, holds more than half the world's known cobalt reserves. And the human rights conditions in some of its mines have become one of the most urgent ethical challenges in the entire technology supply chain. All of this traces back to one discovery, one cathode material, one stubborn physicist at Oxford who refused to accept that the problem was unsolvable. So, what does the story of John Goodenough actually teach us? 3 things, and they are worth sitting. The first lesson is that the most transformative inventions rarely look transformative at the moment of their birth. When Goodenough published his findings on lithium cobalt oxide in 1980, no one handed him a check for $1 billion. No venture capitalists flew to Oxford to give him a term sheet. The discovery sat there, waiting until the right companies, in the right country, at the right moment in consumer electronics history, picked it up and ran. The distance between a scientific breakthrough and a civilization-changing technologies is almost always measured in decades, not months. Patience is not a virtue in innovation. It is a prerequisite. The second lesson is about the structure of who captures value versus who creates it. Goodenough created extraordinary value, Sony, and the Japanese battery industry, and eventually, the entire global electronics and electric vehicle supply chain captured it. This is not necessarily a story of theft, it is a story of how the economic and legal structures around science work, and almost always have worked. The people who discover things and the people who commercialize things are rarely the same people, and the reward the same people, and the reward almost never flow proportionally to the contribution. If you are a scientist, an inventor, or a creator of any kind, understanding this gift is not cynicism, it is survival. The third lesson is perhaps the most personal and the most powerful. John Goodenough spent his entire life proving that it is never too late. His most important discovery came at age 57. His Nobel Prize came at age 97. In a culture obsessed with young founders and 30 under 30 lists, and the mythology of the genius who drops out of college at 19 to change the world, Goodenough's life is a profound and quiet rebuke. The world is not only changed by the young and the fast. It is changed, sometimes most deeply, and the persistent by people who simply refuse to stop asking the question. He passed away in June 2023, at the age of 100, still affiliated with the University of Texas at Austin, still working until nearly the end. The battery inside whatever device you are watching this on right now is, in a very real sense, a monument to that stubborn, quiet, extraordinary man. The next time you plug in your phone, your laptop, your electric car, take just 1 second. Because someone gave you that. Someone spent decades of his life to give you that. And history, as it so often does, almost forgot to say thank you. If this story made you think, made you feel something, or made you look at that charging cable a little differently, hit like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who love stories like this one. Subscribe if you want to keep going down these rabbit holes together. The history of technology is full of forgotten geniuses, invisible breakthroughs, and quiet revolutions that shaped everything around us. And if you want to keep watching right now, the video on screen next is one you will not want to miss. See you there.